Episode 8, Surrender. Megan, as great as the storylines have been so far, I thought episode 8, it just blew me away. It was, I thought, Star Trek science fiction being at some of its finest. So, where do you want to start with episode 8?
Let's start a little bit with someone we didn't talk about much in episode 7. Let's talk about Jack a little, because this is kind of Jack's moment to shine. Although he did have some great fight scenes and some great mind meldy type control last episode. But we get to know a lot more in this episode about how Jack thinks about himself, which is really interesting. Ultimately, he's such a good guy. He doesn't want to be someone other people have to sacrifice their lives for. He doesn't want that. And he has an awareness that there is something probably beyond this syndrome that is now in question about whether he or Picard really have it. There's something wrong with him. There's something different about him that is, of course, corroborated by our resident Betazoid. But let's talk a little bit about his weird mind powers. Because, as we saw, he can connect with another mind and seemingly control them. What was your take on that, Tom?
It's clear something is different in him, and I think we have seen, certainly in this series, and indeed throughout Star Trek, people become more self-aware of their powers and start to grow in their powers, use them, and I think that's what has happened with Jack. It will, of course, continue, hopefully, but we have seen the killing of murder of the 4 changelings, whatever that was a pretty powerful scene. But here we had clearly using his ability to control minds at a distance with no physical contact. And that's something we really haven't seen a lot of before. So I guess I'm seeing growth in whatever his power is. At this point, I'm not sure I knew or understood what type of being he was. And maybe as a being he's growing, not simply that he's recognized powers, but it's clear he's very different. I wondered a little bit how much the differences and how much he was self-aware growing up that he was different, and whether or not he used mind-numbing drugs to control what he was sensing or feeling, like we often hear special or different do in other shows. He was pretty good, whatever reason. And so he's seeing that part of him. We're seeing this growth, and it's a fascinating process to watch unfold on screen.
It is, yeah. I found it quite settling. We touched on a little at the end of the last episode that 7 didn't do the Borg thing. But Jack did, because there was it hasn't been made clear, at least not that I've seen, that there's any kind of consent associated with entering into someone else's mind and controlling their actions. So there, other beings in the galaxy who behaved that way were the Borg. And it did not end well, for they were not the good guys, for the most part, until perhaps the end of the last season of Picard. Still a little unclear. But yeah, so I thought, is there something evil within them? Is there something nefarious? I'm very curious to find out the answer to that.
This episode raised a point that I had thought a lot about at the end of the TV series Tuning In. Listeners will hopefully recall the final poker game where Picard sits in. But in that poker game, Worf and Riker make a pact not to be male competitors for Troy because she's now with Worf. And it made sense back then. I'm not suggesting she shouldn't have been. But I thought she was with Worf. And she had been with Worf going forward. And until this series, I would have thought she had Worf's child, not Riker's. Now, of course, we find out that's completely wrong. She got back with Riker. But it made the Worf-Troy connection as a physical relationship seem much shorter in time than I would have imagined. Did any of that resonate?
No, I'm glad you brought it up, because I had blanked that over from the end of TNG. For me, Riker and Troy I always had as, those two. That's the couple right there. It definitely explains Worf's beautiful soliloquy on seeing her for what was obviously the first time in a long time. That was delightful. But yeah, I guess I always saw Troy and Riker as like the couple.
See, I thought it was Troy and Riker, but Riker screwed it up. And so that's what led to Worf having an opening, and that's what Worf, as a guy, exploited and got the girl.
See, it was as was revealed in this episode. Deanna also, much later, much more recently, screwed it up. So I'd say now they're even, because her going into Riker and taking the edge off that grief—that's a pretty serious violation of a relationship, even if it was well intentioned. I'm glad they worked through it. I'm glad they processed it, had their conversation, and what a charming revelation that they both hate living in the country. That was great. That was couple goals. But yeah, they've both screwed up, I think, and I'm glad they can be friends with Worf.
This week is Surrender. What did you think of the bridge scene where the bridge had been surrendered to Vedic and her compadres? I thought that was just almost horrific.
Oh, it was chilling. It was absolutely chilling. And it would have been so in line with the cartoonishly evil Vedic of the early episodes of this season. But now that we know her backstory and what she's gone through, it's a lot harder not to have... I don't agree with those actions, but I can definitely see the justification for them. That was pretty horrific. I think a lot of it was really unsettling. I think Jack taking over control of that communications officer was unsettling. I think Vedic's toying with people like little blind mice before executing them to get Jack where she needed him. It was all very chilling. And of course, the Shaw and Seven moment of just, you could have prevented this. No, I really couldn't. It was all good.
I felt like Vedic was almost legs off. That it was just that type of mind games and torture she was playing with the bridge crew. And you had to wonder how long Picard and Crusher and Geordi could hold out. At one point I thought, my God, she's going to kill the whole bridge crew.
I definitely thought that too. And I can't help it. Like, when I was little, my mom always told me one thing. And that was, don't dish it out if you can't take it. And it just felt a little bit like that. Like Starfleet dished it out. Now Starfleet's taking it. And that's not good. Eye for an eye, whole world blind and all that. But yeah, it really speaks to the organization.
Yeah. But then we got to the solution.
It was a really cool solution.
It was so cool. Those of you, yes, you could clearly see. Actually, I thought of two things. The first was the next to last MCU movie where Spider-Man comes up with a solution to killing off one of Thanos' henchmen by blowing him off the orb they're on, and it says, came from a really old movie. And that movie was Alien. And so at first I thought, wow, they've tied this to Alien. How cool is that? But
just on that,
blowing people out airlocks and blowing them off bridges is some way to kill someone, and I think it kills them.
I think it does. I wanted to ask you a question, deferring to your greater knowledge of the entire Star Trek universe. Was this the first victory via opening up a hatch on the bridge and blowing everyone out of it? I don't remember ever seeing this before. This particular, I didn't even know bridges had, like, vacuum hatches.
No, it's the first victory. We have seen people killed that way. In the first movie of TNG, first TNG movie, Captain Kirk is blown out of a hatch.
Okay.
So you've certainly seen people killed that way, but it's the first time we've seen it used in a positive manner. And yes, we learned for the first time there's a bridge hatch. That's probably why their officers in...
I thought, so that Vadic dying that way in the solid form of her torture, it seems so pathetic to me, and not pathetic in the nebbish loser kind of way, but like in the having pathos way. It was so sad to me that she had suffered all of this and didn't even get to die in her final form, or her real form. It just, that hit me a little bit.
That hit me after she was ejected from the bridge, and her body then shattered.
Just little pieces.
Into little pieces. And I know there's a movie reference in there, but I can't recall it right now. But that to me was a great ending scene, and I felt that poignancy when that happened.
Yeah, she's just like a character who never had a win of any kind. And yes, she was the villain, not the big bad, but the big bad's biggest henchman. And yeah, I felt bad for her.
So what about Troy and her initial attempts to help.
Really interesting. Everyone, not everyone, but so many people have so much more information about Jack than he does. Right, Vedic knew about the door, didn't explain the door. Deanna immediately knew about the door and couldn't explain the door plainly, but being able to do that together I thought was interesting. She got him to open up really quickly. Someone who never had before, and much quicker than he's opened up to anyone else, I think, in the series so far. But yeah, I haven't watched the last 2 episodes yet, so I have no idea what is behind the red door.
This was the episode where I got my information on Troy, so I thought that was pretty cool. We had a quick reference by Data around Sherlock Holmes. We even had a reference to Tasha Yar, which I'm a little surprised we haven't seen her somewhere in this, but shout out to Tasha Yar, and at least we got a reference, and of course to
Spot the cat, the best cat.
Space Cat. After the last couple of episodes, it was frankly a relief to see the good guys win.
Yeah.
Lose the battle. I know we got more coming, but when you lose a villain or you get rid of a villain as bad as Vedic was in that manner, it was so nice.
Rather spectacular.
And yeah, the whole scene was thought up. Really, I thought Ed great. Well done, I should say, and I really enjoyed that. You have any sort of final or closing thoughts?
Yeah, I thought this was a really just lovely episode, just on what they called the episode Surrender, and everyone was able to break through to the next level by surrendering in one way. By Data surrendering to Lore, he was able to have Lore became him. By Jack surrendering these walls that he's built up, I was able to let Deanna in, and Deanna's going to help him, I assume. And just this letting go of what you think you have to do in order to ultimately achieve victory. I thought it's a really lovely message and often very applicable to regular life.
Well, we're coming up to the final stretch, Megan.
So excited.
Episode 9 and 10.
See you next time. Till next time. Thank you, everyone.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Because That's What Heroes Do. I hope you'll join Megan and I next week where we take up Picard Season 3, Episode 9. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe or rate and review it. This podcast has been a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.